What comes to mind when you think of Roman slavery? Absolute power for the owner, right? A world where they could do anything they wanted to their human property. Well, what if I told you that's not entirely true? While the reality was undeniably brutal, even Roman society had certain lines that, at least on paper, couldn't be crossed. Today, we're diving into the surprising and horrifying things you actually couldn't do to a Roman slave. Let's start with one of the most basic things: outright murder for no reason. In the early days of Rome, a master had the power of life and death. But as the empire evolved, so did the laws. The Petronian law, for instance, made it illegal for an owner to throw a slave to wild beasts in the arena just for their own amusement. They needed official permission from a magistrate, which required a valid reason. Later, Emperor Claudius declared that if an owner abandoned a sick or elderly slave to die, and that slave recovered, they would become free. Emperor Hadrian even went a step further, making it a crime to kill a slave without just cause. Of course, just cause was a huge loophole, but it shows a shift from seeing slaves as mere objects to something more. Next up, you couldn't force a slave into prostitution against their will if their sales contract specifically forbade it. When some slaves were sold, a clause called ne serva prostituta was included. This meant the buyer legally agreed not to sell or force the slave, usually a woman, into sex work. If the owner broke this promise, the slave could be declared free. This wasn't about protecting the slave's dignity, but more about upholding a legal contract and the original seller's wishes. It was a business deal, but one that offered a sliver of protection. Similarly, an owner couldn't just mutilate a slave for no reason. While physical punishment was common and horrifically violent, permanent disfigurement or castration purely out of malice was frowned upon, and eventually outlawed by emperors like Domitian and Hadrian. The law targeted castration specifically, not just for slaves, but for free men too, imposing heavy fines and even exile on the owner. The goal was less about compassion and more about preserving a slave's value as a worker and preventing a decline in population. A maimed slave was less useful, after all. Another surprising one: you couldn't always break up a slave family. While slave families had no legal recognition, like a Roman marriage, customs and economic sense often kept them together. On large agricultural estates, it was more stable and productive to keep families intact. Mass separations could lead to unrest, escapes, and a drop in morale and productivity. Some owners even encouraged slaves to form families to produce more slaves for the household. So while the threat was always there, splitting up a family wasn't a decision made lightly and was often bad for business. Finally, an owner couldn't stop a slave from saving money to buy their freedom. This was called the peculium. Slaves were allowed to earn and save their own money, whether through tips, selling goods they made, or working extra jobs. An owner couldn't simply confiscate this money without a very good reason. Once a slave saved enough to meet their agreed-upon purchase price, the owner was generally expected to honor the deal and grant them their freedom. This system was a powerful tool for social control, giving slaves a powerful incentive to work hard and remain obedient. So, while the life of a Roman slave was filled with unimaginable hardship, the system had its own strange set of rules and limitations. These laws weren't born from kindness, but from practicality, contract law, and the state's desire to maintain order and economic stability. It's a chilling reminder that even within one of history's most brutal systems, there were lines drawn not for humanity's sake, but for the sake of the system itself. Thanks for watching. If you found this dive into the dark side of history interesting, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more. See you next time.